Hello, everyone. This is Buddha Zen Wisdom, here to accompany you every day. Today, we're going to talk about what is the most terrifying thing about growing old. Many people might say that the scariest thing is not having enough money to spend, or being plagued by illnesses in old age. But in reality, whether you'll have money or not in your later years is largely determined by your efforts and decisions during your younger years. When you're able to work, your diligence and rationality will dictate whether you'll be financially secure in your old age. However, when it comes to health, it's a different story. As we age, our bodies inevitably weaken, and illnesses become more common. This is something we can't avoid. So, it's understandable why many people fear falling ill in their later years. It's a valid concern. But even if you do get sick, having money can help you seek treatment and alleviate some of the suffering. However, there's something even more frightening than illness that many elderly people have experienced. Let me tell you about Mr. Chen, a 78-year-old man who is partially paralyzed. After moving into a nursing home, he discovered a heartbreaking truth. The most terrifying thing about growing old isn't illness. Mr. Chen shared his story. My name is Chen and I'm 78 years old. I'm a retired steel factory worker. When I was younger, I experienced the early deaths of my parents and other relatives due to various illnesses, which instilled a deep fear of sickness in me. I was especially afraid of growing old, becoming unable to work, and being burdened with illnesses. The thought of that was unbearable. So, from a young age, I focused on maintaining my health and exercising regularly. From my youth to middle age, I rarely got sick. At the same time, I worked hard to earn and save money, fearing that I or my family might need expensive medical treatments in the future. Despite all my efforts to prevent illness, old age eventually caught up with me. My wife passed away from cancer when I was 62. She had always been healthier than me during our 30 years of marriage, but one day she was diagnosed with late-stage cancer, and no amount of money could save her. She passed away after 4 months of palliative care home. After her death, I became even more cautious about my health. I watched my diet, maintained a regular routine, and attended health seminars. For a long time, my daily life revolved around avoiding illness. This careful lifestyle kept me healthy for many years. But when I turned 72, disaster struck. One morning, I forgot to take my medication, and while riding my bike to the senior activity center, I suddenly felt dizzy, my vision blurred, and I got into an accident. I lost consciousness and crashed into a tree. Thankfully, I was wearing a helmet and thick winter clothes, so I didn't suffer any fatal injuries. However, I fractured my spine, which compressed my nerves. At my age, surgery was too risky, and the chances of recovery were slim. I lost the ability to use my lower body and have been confined to a wheelchair ever since. After my paralysis, my once dutiful children suddenly became distant. My children were my pride and joy. They were well-behaved, excelled in school, and both graduated from university. They found good jobs in big cities and were very successful. Although we didn't see each other often after they left for college, we kept in touch regularly through phone calls and later video chats. They would also send us gifts during holidays, from clothes to household items. Our relatives and friends often envied us, saying we had raised such outstanding children, and that we would be blessed in our old age. However, after they started their own families, their focus shifted away from us. They became more concerned with their own children and households. My paralysis only made things worse. My children began to treat me with indifference and even disdain. After I was discharged from the hospital, I wanted to move in with my son, hoping he would take care of me. But do you know what he said? He told me that his house was too small and uncomfortable, and that he and his wife had to work, so they couldn't take care of me. He suggested I go live with my daughter instead, and offered to pay her to look after me. When I discussed this with my daughter, her response broke my heart. She said, "Dad, you have a son. It's his responsibility to take care of you, not mine. Besides, this isn't my house. It's my husband's and his parents'. Do you really think it's appropriate for you to live here?" I offered to pay her and said her brother would contribute as well, but she still refused. In the end, I had no choice but to use my pension to move into a nursing home. Before moving into the nursing home, I thought my biggest fear was falling ill, as illness would cause me pain, make my children resent me, and potentially take my life. But after living in a nursing home, I realized that for elderly people like me, illness isn't the scariest thing. It's the coldness and indifference of our children. The nursing home I moved into is one of the better ones in the city, with a nice environment and good facilities. But the elderly residents there rarely smile. Their eyes are filled with emptiness, loneliness, and depression. At first, I thought they were just worn down by their illnesses, barely surviving day by day. But over time, I discovered the real reason for their sadness. My roommate, Mr. Zhang, is 2 years older than me. He doesn't have any major illnesses, just a bad left leg that requires him to use a cane. I thought he was better off than me since he could still take care of himself, while I was confined to a wheelchair and dependent on caregivers. But despite his relatively good health, Mr. Zhang rarely smiled. He would often hold on to his old phone, even when it was out of battery and needed charging. At night, he would sometimes cry while holding his phone. I was confused and worried, thinking he might be in pain or suffering from some illness. I frequently called the caregivers to check on him, but they told me that Mr. Zhang was always like this, and that I should just get used to it. I thought the caregivers were being neglectful and unprofessional, but one of them explained the situation to me. He said Mr. Zhang often cried at night, not because of any physical pain, but because he was waiting for a call from his children that never came. Mr. Zhang had been in the nursing home for 7 years. In the beginning, his children visited often, and he was in good spirits. But over the past 3 or 4 years, they stopped coming as frequently, either due to work or family commitments. Since then, Mr. Zhang had been wanting to leave the nursing home and return to his own home. He had caused quite a few scenes, but the nursing home required his children to complete the paperwork for his discharge. Mr. Zhang's son had been repeatedly reminded by the nursing home to take his father home, but he always said he would come when he had time. This kept getting postponed indefinitely. Mr. Zhang believed that every time his son called, it would be to take him home, but the call never came. When he tried calling his son himself, he was scolded and told not to bother him unless it was urgent. So, Mr. Zhang spent his days waiting by the phone, especially during holidays, hoping his son would call. But his son always disappointed him, and Mr. Zhang often cried as a result. After observing Mr. Zhang, I began to notice that many other residents in the nursing home, whether they were sick or paralyzed, were also living in a state of sadness and depression. It wasn't their illnesses that were causing their unhappiness. It was the neglect and coldness from their children. Although the nursing home provided food, shelter, and care, making it seem like a paradise for the elderly, without the companionship of family and the care of their children, it felt more like a prison. I once spoke with an elderly woman living in the room next to mine about my fear of illness. I told her I thought my life was so miserable because I was sick, but she told me not to worry too much about illness, as most illnesses nowadays can be treated with money. What's truly terrifying, she said, is having ungrateful children. Even if she weren't sick, her life would still be miserable because of her children's lack of filial piety. She shared her own story. She was still able to take care of herself and didn't have any major illnesses, but her son was afraid she might pass away at home and decrease the value of his property. So, when she turned 74, he sent her to the nursing home, claiming it was for her own good. He said she would be well taken care of and have company, which was better than living alone at home. He also promised to bring her home for holidays. But in the 4 years she had been in the nursing home, her son only took her home once during the first year. After that, he always had excuses for not visiting or bringing her home. Her old house had been sold, and her pension card had been taken by her son. Now, she had no choice but to resign herself to living out her days in the nursing home, taking it one day at a time. During my time in the nursing home, my own children also became like many of the other residents' children. They visited less and less frequently. Unless I needed to be hospitalized for an illness, my children rarely showed up. So, living in the nursing home made me realize a heartbreaking truth. The most terrifying thing about growing old isn't illness, but the coldness and indifference of your own children. Illness can be treated with money, but if your children are unfilial, there's nothing you can do about it. Sometimes I even feel grateful for my illness, because at least it gives me a reason to rely on my children for support. But reality has proven otherwise. Now, let me share another story about Mrs. Jiang, who raised two college-educated children, but still struggles to make ends meet with her husband. She often says that having money in your pocket is more important than anything else. As for her children, if they can't even take care of themselves, how can they possibly take care of their parents? Mrs. Jiang, 63, and her husband have been working away from home for years. Her husband works as a heavy machinery operator in a Taiwanese-owned company, a job he's held for nearly 12 years. Mrs. Jiang works as a security guard in a small factory. Her husband's salary is relatively high. During busy periods, he can earn over $10,000 a month, and even during slower times, his income never falls below $6,000. Among their relatives and friends, his salary is considered quite high, even surpassing what many younger people earn. Everyone praises him for his hard work and success. But only Mrs. Jiang knows how much her husband has sacrificed for that income. He works in a factory that's scorching hot in the summer and freezing cold in the winter, filled with dust. He never wears nice clothes because they just get ruined in the factory. What's worse, his job is extremely dangerous. Accidents are common, and almost every worker in his department, except the manager, has been injured on the job. Her husband has had 2 workplace accidents, one of which required over a month of rehabilitation. Mrs. Jiang has repeatedly urged her husband to quit this dangerous job, especially when she sees how exhausted he is. But her husband insists that this job pays well, and he just needs to work a few more years to pay off their debts before they can retire. Yet, year after year, they continue to work, even spending holidays away from home. Outsiders assume they have a lot of savings, but only Mrs. Jiang knows the truth. Their savings have been drained by their eldest son's failed business ventures. Over the past few years, their son lost over $1 million in business. Seeing him struggle to borrow money, Mrs. Jiang and her husband couldn't bear to watch him suffer, so they gave him their entire life savings of over $500,000 to help pay off his debts. For an ordinary family, $500,000 is a huge amount, but they gave it away without hesitation. This, of course, caused resentment from their second son, who felt that his parents were favoring his older brother. The second son and his wife often argued about this, with the daughter-in-law even threatening to cut off ties with her in-laws if they didn't treat their children equally. The youngest daughter, though she didn't say much, was also unhappy. She used to call her parents regularly, but after this incident, her calls became less frequent. To make matters worse, Mrs. Jiang has a 96-year-old mother-in-law who needs care. The responsibility of caring for her falls on Mrs. Jiang and her brother-in-law's family, with each household taking turns to care for her for a month at a time. Since Mrs. Jiang and her husband are away from home, they've had to rely on their youngest daughter, who lives nearby, to help care for the elderly woman. Over the years, the daughter has shouldered this responsibility, but now she's grown resentful and refuses to continue. She told her parents, "Whoever's responsibility it is should take care of it. Taking care of your mother is your job. Besides, if you have money to help my older brother, why can't you hire a caregiver?" Mrs. Jiang and her husband were left speechless. To make up for their daughter's efforts, they offer her 2 months' salary, but she refused to accept it and continued to refuse caring for her grandmother. The family's dynamics have become strained due to money issues, and with no one to care for her mother-in-law, Mrs. Jiang had to quit her job and return home. After years of working away, she and her husband moved back to their hometown and had to live with their second son. While it's normal for parents to live with their children, this arrangement was difficult for Mrs. Jiang. Her second son and his wife had been farming and running a small orchard in their hometown, while the eldest son had been away running his business. The second son's family had always resented the parents for favoring the eldest son, and now that they were living under the same roof, the tension only grew. The daughter-in-law even demanded that Mrs. Jiang pay for her own food, saying, "You were able to give so much money to my older brother, so you should be able to afford your own meals. We work hard in the fields, and you're just taking advantage of us. Isn't my husband your son too? The daughter-in-law's resentment boiled over, and she vented all her frustrations. Other mothers-in-law helped take care of their grandchildren, but you've never even looked after my 2 sons. When I gave birth, it was my own family who took care of me. They say a mother-in-law should either contribute money or effort, but you've done neither. Instead, you've come here to take advantage of us. What kind of mother-in-law are you?" Mrs. Jiang was deeply ashamed. She had always been self-sufficient and never imagined she'd be treated this way in her old age. To avoid further conflict, she borrowed money from friends and relatives to build a small, simple house. Even though it wasn't fully furnished, she moved in, saying that having her own space, no matter how humble, gave her peace of mind. Mrs. Jiang had always been against her eldest son's business ventures. She knew her son well. He wasn't well educated and was too honest to succeed in business. But no matter how much she tried to dissuade him, he insisted on trying, saying that he'd never escape poverty if he didn't take risks. Reluctantly, she let him go ahead. After 5 or 6 years, not only did he lose his initial investment, but he also accumulated significant debt. When he finally came to her for help, as a mother, she couldn't turn him away. She knew it would cause tension among her other children, but she couldn't bear to see her son in such a desperate situation. So, she quietly gave him her savings. Now, in her old age, Mrs. Jiang not only has no income, but also has to care for her mother-in-law. She doesn't know how she'll manage. What's even more devastating is what happened during the Lunar New Year. On the 6th day of the new year, Mrs. Jiang's rheumatism flared up, causing her unbearable pain. She asked her second son to take her to the hospital, but her daughter-in-law stopped him, saying, "You spent all your money on your eldest son. Why don't you ask him to take you to the hospital instead of burdening us?" Another family argument was about to break out, and Mrs. Jiang couldn't hold back her tears. She wanted to talk to someone, but her husband had taken on extra security shifts during the holiday to earn more money. He said, "I need to make as much as I can while I'm still able. I'll come home in a couple of years when I can't work anymore." Mrs. Jiang thought to herself, "What good will coming home do? It won't change our reality or resolve the conflicts between our children. It's better to just stay away and avoid the drama." In the end, her second son reluctantly took her to hospital on his motorcycle and stayed with her throughout the checkup, paying for all the expenses himself. But he didn't speak a word to her the entire time, treating her like a stranger. Mrs. Jiang felt heartbroken. She knew her son resented her, but she didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. She tried to start conversation, but they had nothing to say to each other. The mother and son remained silent the whole way home, and once they returned, they went back to their separate lives, like 2 parallel lines that never intersect. As if things weren't bad enough, Mrs. Jiang's mother-in-law fell ill and had to be hospitalized for nearly 2 weeks. The medical bills piled up, and Mrs. Jiang felt utterly helpless. She called her husband, but he had no money left. His salary had already gone toward paying off their debts. Desperate, she reached out to her children, hoping they could help cover the costs or lend her some money. But when she called her eldest son, he said he was still in debt and had to pay for his daughter's education, so he couldn't spare any money. Mrs. Jiang hung up the phone without saying a word. When she called her daughter exploded with anger, accusing her of only thinking of her when she needed something and favoring her sons otherwise. She hung up in a rage. Mrs. Jiang thought her daughter wouldn't help, but to her surprise, her son-in-law later sent her $5,000. He said, "I don't have much, but if your family needs help, I'll do what I can." Mrs. Jiang was touched, knowing that her son-in-law's family was also struggling financially. It showed that her daughter still cared, even if she was upset. After splitting the medical costs with her brother-in-law, Mrs. Jiang's financial burden grew even heavier. She didn't know how she'd manage if her mother-in-law fell ill again, or if she or her husband needed hospitalization. At their age, and with a nearly 100-year-old mother-in-law to care for, the future looked bleak. Faced with the harsh realities of life, Mrs. Jiang once again found herself lying awake at night, wondering if her struggles were due to her own shortcomings or just bad luck. Sometimes, she wished she had more money. In the face of life's challenges, Mrs. Jiang couldn't help but lament that the most miserable thing of all is not having enough money. This is a story of one elderly person's life, but it's also a reflection of the struggles faced by many ordinary elderly people without pensions. Thank you for listening to today's story. If you enjoy Buddha Zen Wisdom, don't forget to subscribe and share. Here, you'll never be alone.